Okay, so I so loved reading your thesis just because I'm not particularly familiar with feminist theory and particularly her work. And so it's just so illuminating to see like your really kind of specific instances of analyzing her language and translation and representation. You're dealing with so many different questions. So maybe I think I just want to start by asking, how did your approach or kind of conception of language change over the course of this thesis?
Sure. I can give you a little bit of background into kind of what I was working with, but I decided to look at the works of Leonora Carrington, who is an author, and she was an author and painter. She did a bunch of other things too, but she was writing kind of from pre-World War II to throughout her career into 2011. And I was definitely coming into this kind of interested in the idea of language, particularly because she wrote across three languages, English, Spanish, French. And I think there's her best known narrative is one that I focused a lot on, called Down Below. And in this narrative, she's, I mean, it's kind of all about language without being about language. And yeah, she is kind of writing from this place. It's considered a memoir, and she's writing kind of from a place of, she's actually writing it while she's interned at what would have been like a sanatorium. This is in the 1940s. And so she's talking, and the really interesting aspect about that text is that she actually wrote it down kind of immediately following her experiences at this sanatorium, lost the text, mediated it to a listener, and then from there, she mediated it in French. From there, it was transcribed and published in French, and then eventually published in English. And so it had this like very interesting kind of just oral history. And so when I was coming to discuss the questions of language, I was really thinking about like, what does it mean for a text to be so mediated and to be come through so many languages? And at the same time, I think like a large part of her project in that text in particular is basically what she calls like crossing into knowledge. And she believes that the her listener, which when transcribed in text format is basically her reader, like the narrator is kind of insisting that there's a huge necessity not only to speak the language, but to understand the language. And this is kind of an idea that she carries on in her better known novel, which is called The Hearing Trumpet. And even by the title of that, it kind of implies the importance of like a dual process, not only of like speaking, but also listening. And so that was kind of like where I was approaching both of these texts from, which is the two, even though she wrote a variety of things, these were the two I was focusing most on.
Yeah, and how did maybe like your understanding of what language means kind of change over the course of looking at her work? And I think at one point you mentioned she's really interesting because she was writing in a language that she didn't really know that well, so each word meant so much. So I wonder, you know, what are kind of the dynamics in analyzing a word that's kind of approached in that way? Because usually we're like we're looking at what's lost in translation, or what
Right.
perhaps isn't there, and this seems to be kind of the opposite.
Right. Yeah, I think I quote in my thesis at one point when she is in her memoir, she's the narrator talking about being in Spain, and she talks about investing in language with a hermeneutic significance. So it's yeah, I think that's a really interesting language, and the way, or interesting idea on language, and the way I was kind of framing it within like the broader feminist discourse was that she is kind of suggesting that she is writing from a place not only that she doesn't, you know, necessarily speak Spanish as well as she speaks her first language English, or French as well as she speaks her first language English, but more the idea that she's kind of caught within this discourse that is sort of not like a woman's discourse, not her subjectivity's discourse. And so she's articulating all her ideas through this. So there's like this real underlying idea of translation, not only in the fact that her works are mediated across different languages, but in the very fact that, especially given her real interest, Carrington's real interest in like questions of the subjectivity of a woman, throughout her text, she's kind of implying that she's not even speaking a language that really means anything to her. And this kind of formed into my broader theoretical argument. It really fed into it in the way that I was kind of suggesting that that I think this process that she's subtly articulating is, I mean, it's kind of just a very broad idea of what we mean by discourse. So if you're not speaking, you know, the centralized language, if you're speaking like a peripherical language, whether it be like an actual, you know, living language, or something as much as like the way we articulate our subjectivity, that the real way that you kind of, you know, create that language is by having like a multiplicity of voices that speak that language. And so that's kind of the idea I was going for, and that's how I tied it in a little bit to her insistence on this idea of the senses, that it's really like the human sensorium that's going to be able to kind of capture how we speak, how we see, how we listen, and that is all incredibly subjective. And then, you know, when processing that, mediating that, writing that all together and combining into like a more formal discourse, that's kind of, yeah, that's the creation of a new language, basically.
Yeah. So I guess as a, you know, a follow-up question to that, did you find that there was a conflict between this kind of emphasis on singular sense experience and then the kind of plural collective experience that's required for like political formation and political collectivity?
Yeah, I think absolutely there exists an inherent contradiction. I think particularly when framing this within like feminist politics and discourse, I mean, the very idea of intersectionality kind of inherently contradicts that, because it's absolutely true that every single woman or person is going to experience the world in a completely different way. I mean, everyone, you know, even the small example of like, no one sees the color blue the same way, or, you know, all of that very specific, I think can be kind of translated to this idea that we all have inherently completely different singular ways of processing the world. And so I think the way that I did try to resolve this was through this like broader model of how we can conceive of both literary and political discourse, and kind of like how the mounting and overlapping and combining of voices, enunciating completely different experiences, can kind of come together and shift kind of the central discourse of it. And that's not to say that the kind of dynamics within further like peripheric and central voices, but, you know, I think it was just, I was speaking more broadly to these ideas. But definitely I think there's a conflict, and I think part of our project now is kind of to negotiate how those can coexist. So.
Right, definitely. I also thought it was really interesting, like your title and what you, how you approached your title in your essay itself. So you know, the title of your thesis is the female version or feminine version of this word that's usually masculine. Is that basically what's going on, or?
Yeah, I can explain that a little bit. So I was working with both the French text of her narrative down below, which is in French is en bas, and English is down below. But in the French version, there's a very early beginning of, in the very opening pages, she makes an appeal to who she calls her listener. And so this is a narrative appeal. And I think if you like, situate this historically, she's actually talking to her actual listener when she was narrating this text, which was a man. And she calls this listener le plus clairvoyant. So it's like the most, you know, with the most clear-sighted, really. And while I was writing, so it's obviously in French, since every word is gendered, it's gendered masculine to reflect the like real biographical figures gender. However, when I was talking a lot about Carrington's text and her use of language, is particularly in Down Below, I was kind of pointing to the ways that she makes very conscious reversals of signs. And this idea for her was actually grounded in this kind of broader feminist theory of the goddess, which there's a lot to explain, but it's kind of this idea that before we had what we call today civilization, we really existed in matriarchal societies and we worshipped goddesses. And so she was very fascinated by that idea. And part of that theory is that when these patriarchal societies and civilizations started building, they kind of completely reversed the signs and the icons and replaced them with masculine figures rather than the goddess imagery. And so her text is like a conscious reversal of these signs, returning to these kind of like primordial goddess worshipping societies. And so even though that's like slightly tangential, I thought it was very parallel to the process of just just the actual simple process of writing and reversing, a sign from masculine to feminine, the way she does with certain legends and myths that she invokes. But so that was kind of like my intentional flipping of the signs to kind of reflect this. So
I loved that. I thought it was so cool. It's like, like translation is working on so many levels within the plot, and how she's like self-referentially kind of talking about language, and then for you to kind of like use translation or like retranslate it in your own way is really cool. So I guess, off of that, did you find that there was a difference between the meanings of like representation and the meanings of translation? Do you think those meanings are kind of gendered in a way? And how did you decide whether or not a particular like refiguration of a sign or I think what you called conscious reversal was a re-representation or like a translation?
I think that's a really good question. I wasn't thinking about it too much when I was writing my text, except that I do think that we have a way of gendering these things. I think like you would maybe necessarily speak of a female narrative as kind of a woman's narrative as translating rather than representing, because I think with the idea of representation, you're kind of assuming that like you have the language, you're coming from a specific language, whereas with translation, it's kind of what we've already talked about. It's like that you're using maybe a language that's not your own to talk about an experience that's not one that maybe you like can inherently express yourself fully with. And so even though I wasn't necessarily like thinking about this, I think that she did have a way. I think what is so important about Carrington's work, and something that actually nuances this like gendering of translation and representation, is that it really did kind of, her representations really did speak out as representations, as completely singular, unique, original ways of articulating a certain narrative. I think even with, for example, the hearing trumpet, just to give a brief background on the text, it's about a 92-year-old woman who gets put in another institution. She gets placed in this time it's like an old folks home, and from there she just goes on this surreal quest, and she establishes a matriarchy with all her friends and truly reverses world order. Like the North and the South Pole shift, the whole world, it becomes the Ice Age again. Like it's completely revolutionary. And I think even things like that, like within the surrealist discourse, the crone is completely antithetical to the idea of this beautiful young muse. And so she was kind of like reappropriating, mocking, subversing these ideas. And I think she did it in a way that she was able to sort of appropriate the language for her own. So it is kind of like between translation and representation when we're thinking about it on gender terms. So
That's really cool. Yeah, I guess like a follow-up question to that. There's a lot about, movement, and I guess movement from certain poles, the North Pole to the South Pole, or the reversal of what is. And I wonder how her work kind of fits into maybe our conversations of like what a world literature or international literature means, like what it means to be a migrant versus an expat. Um, and, you know, I think I was thinking about that one quote that you mentioned where she talks about the world order being dictated by, you know, the quote Chinaman, European, and the Jew, and how a woman must, you know, I'm just reading from her essay, but women must never learn more than the circle around her hearth. And so I guess I'm, you know, wondering maybe like what is there, like how does she approach space and the reversal of space as well as like the kind of charting of movement and of knowledge.
Yeah, that is, I feel like there's so many answers to how she did that because her text focused so much on that. But yeah, let's see. I mean, I think I would start by saying that she herself, obviously, I think like one of, you know, my project was to talk about her representations of statelessness and of migration and of movement, which are such current kind of dialogues that we're having and conversations. We're using a lot of that type of analogy and metaphor in just conversations today. And so that was kind of biographically inspired. But I wasn't trying to translate that too much into like actually reading her text, but inevitably her texts are going to talk about being stateless. And the quote about I think she calls the Jew the Chinaman, and I don't remember the other one, but she's referring, this was from a lesser known text that I kind of used to inform my readings of other texts. And she says the woman must, they all get together. And so, I mean, I think that representation is, first of all, she's not really using language that we would access today. I think she didn't, but I think, you know, she really had this idea that like world order, at least in her conception, the way I was reading it was like world order is patriarchal. And so again, I think one thing that I was trying to negotiate was the fact that she wasn't particularly intersectional in her approach. So she was kind of saying like all around the globe, like women are kind of treated in the same way. And, you know, that's true to an extent, but it can't account for the singularities and nuances. But my project was kind of trying to show how, regardless, just this idea of like one controlling, you know, dominant mode of, you know, governing or existing is kind of how her representations of that can still feed into the way we talk about like women as stateless subjects today.
Right, totally. Yeah, I also wonder like how did your kind of the essence of your thesis or your main argument kind of evolve as you learned more about Carrington and her life and her work and maybe some contradictions that she kind of had within her work?
Yeah. I mean, I think my project definitely evolved because I began thinking about her just kind of in the way that she herself in her, or how her writings kind of, and her paintings, because she was an extraordinary painting, but how she kind of appropriated and subversed the surrealist tropes, and particularly thinking about surrealism as a practice or a movement that kind of just used women as objects. But I kind of quickly moved away from that because basically the only way that she's been written about is that way. And I was more interested in feeding into like a more current conversation. So I really kind of shifted away from her aesthetics. But I think, you know, what's interesting about Carrington is that she was, her first writings, and, you know, they came about in the like late 30s, and then Down Below was published in like 44 for the first time. And so these are pretty early texts. And then same with The Hearing Trumpet, it was published in the 70s, I think. So she was kind of spanning this huge time frame, which saw a lot of change in the way we, you know, the way we talk about feminist politics, the way we talk about gender. I think her use of gender is really fascinating because it seems that she can grasp onto these larger contexts and kind of more current ways that we conceptualize about like the difference between sex and gender today, but she didn't really have the vocabularies to articulate that. And so I think she does present us with a lot of kind of contradictions, because she seems to be grasping at ideas without actually having the vocabularies to articulate them. But nevertheless, that's kind of why I wanted to pin her a little bit as a clairvoyant, because she's, very, despite the fact that she's like spanning this time period, it seems like her ideas continue to have relevance today. We just kind of need to reframe them in our own terms. So
Right. Yeah, I thought like the way you kind of structured your thesis was super amazing, because you start by talking about her ideas in terms of their contrast with Virginia Woolf, or the ideas of Virginia Woolf, and then you end it by talking about the ways that she's foreseeing, or kind of being a clairvoyant to all of these later radical feminists. And it seems like she's kind of in this liminal space where she's like foreseeing all of the future feminist struggles to come, but just, like you said, doesn't have really the vocabulary to think about that, or to explicitly say that maybe. So I guess I'm wondering, what are some other works that she's done that kind of similarly navigate or kind of toggle these two extremes, and what are like other areas of research that maybe need to be kind of investigated further, in order to counter the tropes that or expectations that people might have about her?
yeah, I think there's a lot. I think, yeah, like I already said, I was kind of trying to situate her a little bit away from the surrealist discourse, just because kind of in the second wave, she became well known. Her writings became better known in the 70s and 80s, thanks to the fact that her paintings were so well known. And so we do have a few feminist critics who are writing in those terms. I think like one totally viable route to go with Carrington, which I didn't really seek, was just her discussion of gender and sex. The novel I've already mentioned, The Stone Door, she uses an androgynous figure as her protagonist in that narrative. And so she clearly is working with these really interesting ideas. And I think it's just important that she has implications across the board, not only in like gender and sexuality studies, not only in feminist politics. She also was kind of, not only through her writing, but her actual advocacy, like a pioneer of this idea of ecofeminism, and kind of like returning, as she envisioned it, like Mother Earth to her more natural state. But yeah, I think it's important. She has become slightly better known because the centennial of her birth was celebrated in 2017, but it was almost like, it was very difficult to even find kind of criticism to build upon in her writings, because that has yet to be known. And there's a little bit of an interesting discrepancy in the fact that she is actually pretty well known in Mexico, which is, I mean, she lived out most of her life after she got there in around, I think, 1943. She lived out most of her life there. But yeah, it's interesting, like, why attention hasn't been brought to her kind of in an English-speaking world, and particularly her home country in England. So
Wow. Well, I really enjoyed reading it. And I guess maybe just like one last question. What was the most surprising thing you learned about her, and then also in the larger process of writing your thesis?
Let's see. There were surprises at every every twist and turn. Most surprising thing. I think, man, this is a tough question. Yeah, I think what surprised me the most is kind of what I talked about, or kind of what I built my thesis on, was really just demonstrating like how relevant she is to today's discourse, and particularly just because I do feel that today we are kind of having to restructure. I mean, like, I think this idea of speaking of analogies of migration and movement have become so important in the context of world literature, just in, social and historical context and contemporary context. And I think that her texts really do give us a new entry point into how to negotiate certain, discrepancies, certain things that this discourse hasn't accounted for. So I think, what energized me most about reading Carrington's work was the way that it felt, that it had such present day relevance. And then I think in the process of investigating and writing. I don't know if this is so much a surprise, but just I was really wishing and hoping for more on her, because I think she is just such a source of, you know, incredible, not only like artistic and literary prowess, but she is just, the way that she was able to kind of bring together her writing and her advocacy for feminist politics was really incredible to me and inspiring. So I guess I would say that I just would love to see more written about her and more critical discourse around her. So.
Totally, you should. Yeah, I think you're definitely a Carrington scholar now. So, definitely. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you. It was awesome talking to you.